William Ramsey. Thanks again for joining me today for another conversation on the Smiley Face Killers.
Great, thanks for the invite. It's glad to be back.
Absolutely. And I recently just finished your SFK Part 2 documentary, and maybe we can start there. That was another great effort on capturing this phenomenon, and you did so by kind of doing some case files, and I'll let you explain that from there.
Yeah, I think that I just really tried to expand upon my first one, which was kind of much more detailed, much longer, as a matter of fact, 3.5 hours. But I really just wanted to show that it was a global phenomenon. I come into contact with information about cases that were taking place in Europe, Australia, UK again. But so I really just wanted to expand upon that. So I added a lot of case files, but also there were new kind of perpetrators that fit into who I think is committing these crimes. Like much like my first documentary, I included names of people like Stephen Port or some of these other dark actors who I think were involved in this stuff. Or it's Port, actually. The inquest is still going on in the UK. So there's definitely been new developments and new victims, and the phenomenon itself is still taking place. So the second documentary is SFK, The Global Slaughter Continues is the title.
Yeah, and it's a great documentary as far as the continuation goes from the last one, because you do have a great effort on showing how many more of these cases are really out there.
Yeah, what the scary thing is that I just tried to curtail it and keep it low, but I probably left a whole nother documentary on the cutting room floor, like of other cases that I could still continue on. So my case list is probably 200 to 300 victims that fit the profile perfectly of younger men in strange environments, disappear, not necessarily even close to the water, but then end up found in water. So,
sure. Yeah, and in your documentary, I saw that you captured a number of cases I was familiar with and a couple cases I wasn't familiar with, in fact. So you did a good job as far as casting a wide scope there.
Well, thanks.
But one of the things I noticed you did there as well was, identifying some of these additional MOs. Now, you just mentioned kind of the classic smiley face killer mode of operations. The young man, oftentimes highly intelligent, oftentimes highly skilled young man, college-aged predominantly, goes out drinking, disappears, and then is later found X number of days later, drowned in a local body of water. Now, you actually took that a step further this time and kind of showed, I thought, in this documentary where there may be, in fact, different cells. As there are different terrorist type of cells, there could be different cult type of cells committing these crimes as well. That's kind of what I gathered from sort of the message of what your new Part 2 documentary was stating.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, if you look at the one guy who popped up earlier this year, Katunsky, out of Michigan, his victim's name was Kevin Bacon. It was something that fits into this kind of general profile of my research, which I found out a lot of these Grindr, these kind of dating apps, tend to be involved, particularly with some of the old cases that I've studied, but it's still, that theme is consistent in the new cases. And this victim was Kevin Bacon, the same name as the actor, who interestingly got involved in this case because of the name similarity. So the real actor, Kevin Bacon, actually he got tagged and was involved kind of a little bit in a tangential way. But yeah, Katunsky himself is interesting because it opened up and confirmed or validated some of the speculations. Hold on just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Can you hear that?
Barely. It's not that loud.
Okay. So anyway, so it kind of confirmed the stuff. Katunsky was an older guy, 50, who had a very strange personal life. He was married, had kids, but he was involved in this kind of wolf underground where they were talking with each other online and sharing information that, they were talking about full moons. They had insignia or iconography, and they had kind of inside jokes. And this is kind of like a subset of the gay community. It was very strange. And one of the other oddities about this Bacon case, and I give credit to the police that were in Michigan, is that they either got some information or heard of something from my documentary or something, but he had a secret room in his basement, and he allowed the cops in. He gave them consent to search, and somehow they found that secret kind of dungeon that was in his basement. So they either were smart enough to look for it or had an inkling or hint.
Sure.
So...
and that was a good conclusion I thought you reached in your first part of your documentary, part one, with the kind of psychosexual aspects of these crimes, where it's not necessarily just the act of murder. There are some motivations of a religious and sexual nature, it seems.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at Peter Christopherson, guy who's been around and was in all these kind of underground industrial bands and stuff like that, and that whole story with, I think it was Broken, was the video that kind of played out the kind of MO of the SFK. So you see that played out with Katunsky as well. And one of the interesting facts I've learned of Katunsky from Jim Smith, who was the chief researcher for the film, is probably the guy with the most knowledge about this phenomenon anywhere.
Sure.
He's willing to talk about it publicly.
Sure, I agree. I communicate with Jim Smith, your researcher, frequently on Twitter.
Yeah, so he's really
Very
on point.
knowledgeable.
Yeah, I mean, really, more important to me than the original investigators, Gilbertson and Gannon. But
and I can agree with you on that regard, because one thing that Jim Smith's work has produced, as far as opening up my eyes and changing my perspective on the subject, in similar fashion to what we're talking about right now, is there's clearly different cells. There's clearly different groups, different cults, different chapters, whatever you want to call them, operating somewhat, with the other chapters or groups, but also somewhat independently. So when they commit these crimes, there are some certain different aspects that I think, again, in number two, one of those precise aspects would have been the finding the victims submerged in retention ponds. Yes. You found a very small geographical area in which that was occurring, and I would say that's a good example of a group that's operating in that area that may be operating differently than maybe a group in Georgia or California.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I think those were the Indiana cases, right?
They were. In fact, you had a couple of them which I thought were like the key highlighted ones, but there are a few more. I think they probably could be added to that list with the retention ponds between Indiana and Ohio.
Yes, I think you're right. So that's an interesting point too, and you just see that same pattern. So I can't remember the kid's name who was there, but like it fit all the profile. He traveled somewhere to meet someone and disappeared, and then ended up in a retention pond. Yeah. So
I think it was Joshua Swalls was the individual in the documentary.
Yeah, there were Swalls, and there was another one that ended up in the same retention pond from the same bar, like a year later, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there was.
I think it was even a month. It was even a month.
Month later. Okay, yeah, my memory. Yeah. But yeah, So, yeah, no, but that's an excellent point. You make an excellent point there.
Yeah,
so
that's a great example of have a small geographic.
But
go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to Jim Smith, finishing my thought, Katunsky, he traced his work history to the island exactly where Dakota James was found back 2-3 years. Yeah, so he used to work at this chemical company that had somebody had a placement there. That's exactly where, and he was, Dakota James was missing, and I updated him on the second documentary too, because there's more important, salient, pertinent information that came out about him, but they were found right there off the Ohio River, right where Katunsky had his footprint. It's incredible.
That is an interesting point of fact, because that definitely draws for more questions to the matter.
Yeah, and Katunsky has like a mental case history. I mean, the guy fits the profile of a lot of these other, like Herb Baumeister, who operated in the Midwest, who was a serial killer, and some of the Eiler, who I did a show about. Her name was Kolarek, who studied this other guy who would actually cross over the border. I think it was Illinois and Indiana, and knowingly switch in between jurisdictions to confuse the police. Right there in the Midwest.
That's extremely clever.
Yeah, and that actually, I was told by another researcher that her book was found with Jeffrey Dahmer. That was one of the books that he was reading, a book about this other homosexually motivated serial killer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and folks like Dahmer definitely seem to have at least the circumstantial evidence supporting that they're part of a larger network.
It seems like it,
There's definitely numerous times in Dahmer's biography of events in his life that I've definitely said, like, that doesn't seem right. Like, this seems like this is evidence of him being part of a larger network.
But you see him operating, traveling through gay bars and stuff like that, and you see these other guys. Dakota James' example was, I think, popping in and out of that kind of bar life before he disappeared. So, yeah. So
and there was another one in Columbus, Ohio, that you featured in your first documentary. That's a Cincinnati, Ohio resident, or was native to Cincinnati, Ohio.
Yeah, that's Joey LaBute.
Met his demise.
Yeah,
correct, Joey LaBute, and he was very much in the same capacity, going through gay bars and gay dating apps. He seems to may have fallen victim through one of those measures.
Correct.
Where he's getting targeted through the bar, or he's getting targeted through the app.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. It's pretty dangerous. So, yeah, a lot of really new, updated information, important stuff that I think tells more of this story. And I've actually had communications with other investigators who've traced some of the early, the early first victim zero in New York to people who were in New York who were interested in that same kind of stuff. BDSM, yeah. So
yeah, I think you really hit a home run there with some of those aspects of the BDSM, from underground from your first documentary. I really do think that you have definitely struck something there that seems to be right on target with the exact group of people that may be perpetrating these things.
Well, I think it explains the odd duration between when the person disappears and when they're found. Because typically, and if you look through my first documentary particularly, there's these immense searches that are going on. Very careful searches, very meticulous water searches, and nothing's found. And then somebody shows up. Shane Montgomery outside, I think, of Philadelphia. They found his car keys, but they didn't find him. I mean, what's that tell you?
Yeah, so only a few feet of water, too.
Right, so you can see the pictures of them. They're like in waist-deep water going through, I forgot the name of the river out there, but...
I'm glad you brought that point up, because that is another salient characteristic of these crimes, is that the area in which the victim is found is an area that's already been searched quite extensively.
Right.
And one of your examples from the new documentary was an individual named Kyle Rogers.
Kyle Rogers, right.
Young man who disappeared 2 years ago in Illinois.
Right. Outside of Chicago, right? West of Chicago.
I think he was more southern Illinois.
Okay.
I don't precisely know. It was Belvedere, Illinois. I know it's on the west side.
Yes. Yeah, so this is like another, fits the same profile. I think he was at a bar, disappeared, missing.
Classic, yeah.
Classic, yeah.
Classic victim profile points right there. And the area he was found in was maybe 6 inches of water, and it was searched earlier that day.
Right. So how was this happening? It's the same thing that happened with Dakota James. Like the police actually, I showed that in my first documentary. When did you search the island? Oh, just this weekend. When is he found? Monday morning. So somebody's doing something late night or early morning, Sunday night or Monday morning when it's quiet and nobody's watching. So
it almost seems like they're paying attention, though. Would you agree that the perpetrators of these crimes are watching the police activities to know when and where to dump the bodies?
Yes, I would agree with that.
It definitely seems like that is an element, yeah.
Because these cases are very, they're in the news. They're very well covered, at least initially, until the body's found. But they're very much in the news.
Which is aided in your documentary has shown that all of this news footage. I mean, I follow these cases, and I'm sometimes surprised when I watch your documentary.
You just bugged out there for a little bit.
It does seem to get an extensive amount of news coverage, which then begs the question: what happens? Why the media onslaught, and then nothing really? There's no investigations. Kind of everything goes by the wayside once the victim's even found.
It's incredible. I mean, you'd think that if they took an overarching look at the enormity of this phenomenon, they would still look into it. And I think it's changing. I think Katunsky is a perfect example of that change. But
really?
Yeah, because I think that the cops seem to know or anticipate what to do looking at their kind of fact pattern. Because they knew that Kevin Bacon had been on a dating app, and it seems like they just said, well, let's figure out where he went. Because they could have done the same thing or subpoenaed information from Grindr for Joey LaBute and Dakota James, but that never got publicly... It was never shown in public that they did that.
Right.
It was never, they never took that step. Yes. So they figured out Katunsky from the grinder information, and then they seemed to know, okay, this is what we're looking for. This is probably what's going on. And they had probably had the information. Katunsky had potential victims run from his house screaming and shouting, which is,
wow.
So that was in the news as well. So it seems like this kind of, and I think that's why these cases have been veiled in mystery and confusion, is people didn't understand the motivation and the MO. So the cops didn't either. So that's why they don't see these, they don't quite look at these bodies who are in water, not necessarily drowned, as something malevolent or
that seems reasonable. I think that's an easy way to explain the lack of interest from the police in many circumstances.
And I think the public, I think that it's just a shame for me that a lot of these cases are written off, and that some of them are turning around to be murder. It was the Chris Jenkins case. The cops flipped and went back and said, okay, this is probably some form of murder. It's not an accidental death. But I do think so. At least some of the sensibilities are changing.
No, I think you make some good points there. And I think Chris Jenkins is a good example. We're looking at 20 years later for many of these cases now. And, we're trying to wonder what's changed, or how is this evolving. I think you've made some good points there for how the investigations in some police, some jurisdictions, obviously not all jurisdictions,
correct,
but some jurisdictions I think have taken note.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think unfortunately in the case of Dakota James, the prosecutor there just basically said there's nothing suspicious. I show in my newer documentary that there's something very suspicious, and even Cyril Wecht thinks something suspicious because the guy had freaking ligature marks on his neck that anybody could see.
Yeah,
yeah, you just look at it.
Well, the other thing that I thought was suspect with him, that the law enforcement seemed so willing to discard, was the previous kidnapping attempt weeks earlier.
Right. That's an excellent point. Yeah, so that was, I referenced that in the documentary. It was an article in the Daily Beast. I don't know if it's you or me, but you're popping in and out.
My friend had to come pick him up.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
It's probably me. But anyway, it's okay.
Well, give me 1 second. My computer automatically switched back to my 2G modem instead of my 5G. That could be it. Okay. It shouldn't disconnect us. Let me switch here though.
Okay.
Possibly.
All right, cool. You're definitely back.
Good?
Yes.
Okay.
So, so I think that hopefully there'll be more and more people kind of taking a look and looking with a more critical eye.
Yeah, I like to think so. And, I think the other limiting factor there is something I think you've addressed and something I've addressed, the topic of kind of debunking the debunkers. Because a lot of times when someone has questions on these things, they'll go on the internet and they can see, the FBI report saying that there's nothing here to look at, or the Center for Homicide Research concluding there's nothing here to see.
Right.
And I think these agencies, they're not doing any service in the matter as far as just writing things off immediately. I tend to think they probably have ulterior motives, but that's just me.
No, I totally agree with you. I actually think the FBI is hyper corrupt now, something that I didn't know the totality. I think that a lot of the stuff that's being put forward in the public has probably been going on for decades. And some of the actors I've seen in the FBI are less than honest with, they don't have any integrity to the truth, in my opinion, which is my opinion. But John Douglas, just the guy, his work on the West 53 was an atrocity. But the research brief, they're looking at all the information that they've garnered, really, in my opinion, from Gilbert and Gannon. And I think that if I would criticize them, and I've done this in the past, it's that they just haven't put all their evidence out into the public. I think they've kept the cards close to their chest, and I think that's an error for a lot of reasons, because they're not letting the public sift through and kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and determine it. So, in some ways, I credit.
You make a good point there.
Yeah, I credit Jim Smith, and I tried to do myself as well. But I think that once you look at all the evidence that's put out, it's undeniable this MO is happening in a global manner. And I mean, it's probably even worse because of language barriers, because somebody in Spain or in some of these other countries in Germany may know that these phenomenons are happening, but they just aren't able to kind of decipher the Tower of Babel and look at these other phenomenons in other languages and other nations.
Sure, I think that's reasonable. And as far as the FBI goes, yeah, they're definitely seeming more corrupt as the days go on lately. And, you look at those aspects where they're clearly, subverting justice in numerous cases across the FBI, not just like one area or one person. It seems to be fairly widespread, and you combine that with the fact that the FBI for 40 years outright denied the existence of organized crime.
Right.
So we may be speaking of an occult crime or some ritualistic crimes here with the smiley face killers, but I mean, the fundamental basis of it, it's organized crime.
Yes, it's a form of organized crime. I agree with that.
Yeah. And the FBI has a lengthy history of covering up organized crime. For 40 years, J. Edgar Hoover even said publicly there's just no organized crime. After there's congressional hearings after the death of John F. Kennedy. Right. J. Edgar Hoover is still testifying there's no such thing as organized crime. It's completely preposterous at that point.
It's preposterous. Well, and then the other interesting, I'm glad you brought up the occult crime, because not only do people send me this research brief from the Center for Homicide Research all the time, which I think I effectively debunked. Yeah, so they just send it to me and go, hey, here's the obvious, it's debunked. Yeah.
Obviously, you didn't read this.
Yeah. Okay, for the fifth time. But they also, the Lanning report is oft mentioned by other ex-FBI people as this kind of go-to report that supposedly totally debunks the notion of occult-motivated crimes. And then you read the Lanning report, and he doesn't quite say that. He said that a lot of these, I mean, the gist or the crux of what Lanning writes is that he thinks that a lot of these pedophile crimes were not occult related. They're really just pedophile crimes. That's really the gist of the Lanning report. So these other people, the FBI, are misinterpreting or actually just got bad information. And the way that Lanning kind of goes out and supposedly debunks or discredits occult motivated crime is his standard. I mean, you have to appreciate it as an attorney. So you set up this obtuse, obscure standard that nothing could ever do. Like, I have to go back and look at the Lanning report, but I think he says to be an occult crime, you have to be in a cult and then say, I'm doing this for the purpose of occult means, and then stand on my left leg and touch my nose. And if you don't do that, it's not an occult crime. Right. So that's how he describes it. So he's basically discounting people like Richard Ramirez. He's discounting Jesus Adolfo Constanza from Mexico. He's just discounting all these other people who are occultists. I mean, you can talk about Damien Echols, occultists who, you don't know what happens at the actual day of the crime, but there's all kinds of stuff around them that show an occult purpose, occult influence. So anyway, so the Lanning report to me is ridiculous. I think the FBI discounting this. What did they say? To date, we have not developed any evidence to support links between these tragic deaths or any evidence substantiating the theory that these deaths are the work of a serial killer or killers. So I think, but the other thing is that I kind of gave them a little buy in the sense that they didn't look at all the evidence. I think the article for the Center for Homicide Research, which was mentioned, I think on Dr. Phil, or referenced on Dr. Phil, because both of the guys, Gannon and Gilbertson, were on Dr. Phil when their series about the Smiley Face Killers came out on Oxygen, which I highly recommend. It's a 6-part series. You can watch it, rent it on iTunes. But like I said, I mean, I think that my criticism of that, I think they go in depth in Dakota James, and their research into Dakota James is superb. But like the shortcomings, it's only 6 cases. It's not showing the breadth of this phenomenon.
I think they're doing a season 2, to my understanding.
Okay, well, I hope they do. Yeah. So
it's supposedly in the works right now, or was prior to the shutdown of things, I believe.
Well, that's good news. I'm glad that that's happening. So anyway, the Center for Homicide Research was done in 2010. So
no, I mean, you make some fair criticisms, William, in regards to some of their research. In their defense, I think maybe they have some factors why they're not sharing things, or just the reactions in which the media or the FBI treated them initially maybe is prevented them to be a bit more apprehensive in releasing additional data. However, the additional data they have, or the data they have, is clearly relevant. I mean,
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it. Yeah. So the fact that they are holding it could obviously be limiting things.
Right, but I think that the key book you really want to read on the subject is Case Studies in Forensic Drowning. That's their book. That's what they put out. That's really the book that I go back to. So I'm not throwing them out.
I mean, that's what got me interested in the topic as well. So I agree with you there.
And I think that I think Gannon and Gilbertson proved that the symbol of this smiley face is an element to some of these crimes. And, and I think I've bolstered that through more of my research, seeing things in the media and in Hollywood, and some of these other cultists are clearly using the smiley face symbol in certain situations.
I would agree with you. Your first documentary on the subject was an eye-opening experience to me in the use of the smiley face, all the way down to Burrows. I mean, some of the characters involved. Yeah,
I mean, I didn't know much about Burrows, but I mean, you could actually make the argument that, and I don't know enough about Nirvana, but Kurt Cobain using that skewed smiley face from Burrows, and he did an album with Burrows. Like, he had and these guys are together, Leary and Cobain and Genesis P. Orridge, who I featured in the first movie. All these guys go back.
And recently passed, right?
Yes, correct, just this year. So,
yeah. Who
was in a movie with Damien Eccles. So you can kind of see the genealogy of this ideas going all that far back. And people reference, the smart kind of leadership of maybe left-hand path interested people, go back to or through Burrows.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lineage there. I think you struck on a vein of some sort. I mean, whether or not it's the whole story, it's certainly part of the story. Yeah,
and the other interesting thing is also, like, the new Burrows is Chuck Palahniuk, right? Or whatever you pronounce his name, Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club. And when you read that book, you realize how sophisticated he is and how knowledgeable about the occult. And at the very end, when Tyler Durden, who's a 5 and a 6, right? 5 letters and a 6, like the number of 11, the number of magic, the pentagon and the pentagram and the hexagram. You realize he shoots himself in the face. The book ends with him having a smiley face at the very end. It's incredible. Sure. It's incredible. I feature that in Occult Hollywood. I touch on that. And there's a smiley face in the film. There's smiley faces all through Fight Club if you watch it. Very carefully. They're carefully placed. It's very sophisticated. But, I mean, even Brad Pitt's making thumb on his chin hand signs and all this stuff. There's all kinds of occult stuff in Fight Club.
Yeah, I obviously haven't maybe running through with a fine-tooth comb for the occult undertones, but I've certainly picked up on a few of those, especially the smiley faces. Yeah. After watching your documentary, I see smiley faces more and more everywhere I go. Yeah, no, you got to ask the question: why is it there? Why are these there at these certain times? Why are they placed there in these films? Yeah, a lot of times it's the context I question. Yeah, but it almost feels like it's the right context, right? Like, this is where it's supposed, like, the symbolism, the symbolic meaning of it. Whether you go through The Watchmen, whether it's No Country for Old Men, whether it's Fight Club, it's all a big joke, right? It's right there. Yeah, it's the same. It is. Yeah, so. It seems to be that seems to be the undertone, a dark humor, and possibly even chaos. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing with the smiley face killers. That's anyone perpetrating such a crime would seemingly have that chaos at the root of the person. That their nature of a person would be seeking kind of that chaotic atmosphere, maybe. Yeah. That's not the way good. No, but it's true. Just trying to paint a picture of the criminology of the person who would be involved in such a crime. I think it's a good point. I mean, I think you make a great point there, because a couple cases come to mind. It was the one out of Philadelphia where, what's his name? I can't remember his name. But Tommy Booth. Booth, yes, very good. Where he's like, I don't know who these people are. They're sketchy. Yep. I'm suspicious about them. And then he's found in 6 inches of water, like the previously searched water, where there on the wall is like a big sigil with a smiley face, right? So, and when his uncle retold that story in the Oxygen Network television show, when they interviewed him, this guy's a retired Army colonel, and he looks, well, as he's trying to tell this story, like, he doesn't understand. This is the man who thought he understood the world, it seemed, and then his nephew ran afoul and died this way, and he doesn't seem to be able to put these things together in his head. Interesting. Yeah. No, it's hard. I mean,
I think that the motivations of a cult or those ideas are so not condemned, but kind of shunned or frowned upon or laughed at, that people have shut down that element of their minds to look into that as motivation. So,
no, I think you're right. I mean, it's more of a kind of a sliding scale. Like as I learned of the Smiley Face Killers 12 years ago now or so, it's been a progression to understand more and more of the occult nature of what these crimes could be.
Yeah, and I mean, there's that whole code of silence. There's initiation, right? So, like if you look at the Temple of Psychic Youth that Orge ran, it's like a militant organization with cells. It's really a cell. I'm not saying that they're the ones involved in the Smiley Face killing, but if you look at how it's set up, it's cellular. There are people in different cities with a head who is telling you what to do, or sending out information. So you're going up a scale. If you look at the organization of the Process Church, much like that as well. Different cellular.
You actually just took the words out of my mouth, because I was going to ask you how this relates potentially to Thelema or Process Church, for that matter, as an offshoot of Thelema.
Well, I think that if you go and kind of look at the genealogy of Crowley, died in 1947, OTO, and then off branches, and then there's like the Illuminates of Thanateros. Leary was one. Christofferson was one. These guys, but they're also involved in other stuff, so it's hard to really put a pin on it. But
so there may not be that group as a perpetrator, but that group somehow may overlap with memberships of the group.
I don't know, yeah, I think it's unfortunate that some of these people who are caught, they get busted for the crime, but nobody really asks them those pertinent questions. How did you get into this? Who were you with? And if you look back at some of these similar crimes, it's pretty apparent that people are working in tandem. If you look at Kraft or Eiler or some of these both of the people who wrote books on McDonough and Coleridge said these guys could not have committed their crimes by themselves. So it's like, what's going on? I think
that's far more common amongst quote-unquote serial killers than is commonly believed about.
Yes, I totally agree. If you look at, what's the other guy who had the kids underneath his house? What was it? Gacy. Clearly, clearly had another dude. Somebody said one of the victims who got away said he was in the room and he said the light turned on in the other part of the house.
So I agree. Yeah, that's a great example, John Wayne Gacy. And in studying, using that as an example, he was extremely well positioned within the Democratic National Committee of Illinois.
Yeah, and he was also in like some other social group. Yeah, I forgot which one. It was either the Knights of Columbus he was high up in. He was always having social meetings and connected. He was mixing it up with people, and at the very end, where he was dispensing the bodies? In rivers. The last 4 victims he threw off a bridge. And then you kind of can take it to the Atlanta child murders. Same thing. All water, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think there could be a larger network we just don't understand, not knowing some of the factors of the occult ritual aspects of these crimes.
Don't know, but you don't know what's going on the dark web. You don't know where people of similar interests. And I think it goes back to this guy who was recently arrested, Katunsky. He had this weird wolf lycanthropy subset where they would go. There were inside jokes of going out on full moons and howling. And other people who were also interested in the same stuff, like conifer. And there was one. I mean, his Instagram is somewhat telling because he also had anti-Christian animus, right? So he's always like, oh, these evangelical Christians are going to come here, and this is what I'm going to respond with, So he kind of had an anti-Christian bias, which a lot of these occultists do. If you look at Orge or these other Crowley, also, there was one that he was with his boyfriend at the time, and says, "We're the type of people your parents warned you about." Like that's what he wrote.
Yeah.
So
I like to think that. I think some people maybe think that some folks are being facetious making such statements like that. I generally take people for their word. If they're going to make a statement like that, I think there's probably more to that story.
I think there's a lot more to that story. I think there's a lot more to the Stephen Port story. I think they only got him for 4 victims. I wouldn't be surprised if these guys are much more active. And there's the other guy who I wrote about who had 2 victims, whose name I don't recall, but they their victim pool may include people that I have studied on the SFK, phenomenon.
Sure,
it wouldn't surprise me at all.
That seems reasonable. Sure. Now, if there's serial killers like John Wayne Gacy and possibly he could be involved in occult things, and we see other politicians today that seem to be highly enveloped in occult activities. I'll throw out the name John Podesta as an example.
George Bush. Look at the Bush family.
George Bush would be another great example.
Yeah,
yep.
Skull and Bones.
Both sides of the aisle.
House of the Temple, right? Both sides of the aisle. House of the Temple, Bohemian Grove. They don't go to church, man. That's their place. House of the Holy, so to speak.
I think you're spot on there. This is their religion, in as far as a religious worldview would go for somebody. And if that is the case, then do you suspect there could possibly be political involvement as far as squashing these cases ever reaching the light of day?
Yes, I think that's potential, no doubt.
Yeah,
and I think even in Pittsburgh, like I've heard stories about. Yeah, I mean I don't want to go into details, but there's a lot more going on. And I think I talked to was one. He probably doesn't want his name mentioned, but he said it's like they don't want to admit that it's happening. They don't want to scare people. Kind of like Jaws, I think what was the city Amity. We're up for business. It's kind of like what's happening with this COVID thing, Like, hey, there's no problem here. We've just had 80,000 people die in the last 2 months, but hey, get back to work.
I can see where that viewpoint may be as far as kind of generally speaking, but then the more and more you look at the details, you got to kind of almost have to come up with some reason or motivations at least behind why some of these departments would want to continue to actively fight the family or actively fight, the detectives that the family hires or actively fight the coroner that the family hires. It just seems like there's a lot of pushback. Even,
there are. But look at the money. Like, look at the colleges. What if they just lost 10% of their students because somebody found out that city was dangerous or there's a serial killer? It's an immense amount of money at stake, man. And reputational damage, too. Oh, Pittsburgh is a terrible town. They just let the criminals run loose and kill kids and rape kids. So,
there's certainly some political concerns for sure. Yeah, definitely.
At
some point in time, I really question the lack of concern, just generally speaking on the subject matter, because and they kind of highlighted some of this during the Oxygen series, especially relative to the Dakota James family. I mean, anytime I see anything with the James family, I'm appalled the manner in which that family's been treated.
Oh, it's outrageous. It's totally outrageous. One of the interesting things that I've talked about with some of the other people is that the families all don't seem to be super active. They don't seem to be don't seem to be like, I don't know what the word is. It's like they're not people who are politically active. It's almost weird, like the victim pool. It's almost like something going on like the Morlocks and the Eloy, where they don't seem to have that ability to work through the system effectively.
So I've heard you make that statement before, just like you said there, that the families may not be, accustomed to the procedures or know exactly what's going on, or may just be shut down through fear. Well, Alex Holden of Sacramento from your Part 2 documentary, that's not his family. Did you want to speak to some of the victims' profile?
Yeah. Well, it's not. I don't know what's like the follow up is what's happened since then, but he was a young guy, typical MO, fit the profile of a victim, a good looking guy, and he was in downtown Sacramento. I had an argument with his girlfriend and walked out, and I think he was missing for 39 days. Like, I can't remember, 30 days, right? Missing a long time, and then in the same story, rigorously searched. And in the same area where he was found, and then his dad said he was found in water. I didn't get all the details. That also has like that whiff of like the police or the authorities are exercising information control, and they do exercise information control. Because when I first was researching my first documentary, I called a couple police departments, man. It was like, pulling teeth, man. You couldn't get any information out of them. Nothing. Hey, I'm calling about this guy. I just want to know a few details. Nope. Talk to our information. Hang up. Call back. Wait online. Well, who are you? What do you want? What's the information for? I mean, it was just like it. Once I realized that was the approach of all the police departments, I was like, oh, this is not a situation that's collegial or they don't have a warm regard
not
for
at all. It's kind of what I was getting at. I've definitely experienced the same warm reception from a number of law enforcement departments in regards to questions, and it boggles my mind to maintain this attitude.
Yeah, but it's also what's interesting is like the willful denial of looking at facts, because I know another author who is an ex-cop who's written on these subjects, and he just keeps going back to the same Gilbert and Gannon kind of analysis, the same cases, and doesn't look at the broader
Is this
context.
guy from Milwaukee?
I mean, so
from Wisconsin?
Yes. you know who he is.
I don't want to invoke his name or his wild followers. Okay. I've gone round and round with these folks on Twitter, and he's called me every name under the sun, and I just tell him, you know what, you want to have an adult conversation, you let me know.
Well, it's also interesting too, because I've kind of just sit here like I'm pretty much, you want to do an interview, okay, let's do it, but nobody really ought to ever debate me. Like, let's have just even as like a gentlemanly, somebody just wants to debate, just to take up the side of the antagonist, just to do it, just for the exercise. Like, I'm willing to do that as well. Nobody debates me on these cases, the West Memphis 3. Like, it's just like shooting arrows over the internet or Twitter. But never really getting into the never getting into the meat of the matter.
We won't discuss facts when we want to criticize your work. Basically what they say. Right?
No, honestly, I wish that it wasn't true. Like, when I first thought of the Smiley Face, I came at it from a different angle because I was researching what the Smiley Face meant. Like, I came at it from a different angle. So I was like, oh, what? I remember people talking about this on Coast to Coast. And then I started watching the cases, and really the first case that I watched from disappearance to found in water was Joey LaBute. And then I just kept watching them happen. Then I hooked up with Jim, and I'm like, hey, man, this thing is real. And he's like, I know it's real. I've been watching it for 2 years. And this is like 4 or 5 years ago. And
I was a drunk kid at a bar who, fit the victim profile. That's what really caught my eye with the Smiley Face Killers, because I used to frequent bars in my mid-20s at the time when this phenomenon first started kind of gaining ground on the media and whatnot. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't want to fall victim to that. I better figure out what's going on here. And then just over time, I see it more and more. I just can't ignore it. I see there's more victims. This happens here. It's the same profile situations, and the police handle it the same way and just kind of pretend like it never happened.
Yeah, I think it's a really harder thing to really say, okay, this person is murdered, let's look into this. It's really just easy just to say accidental death, drowning. A lot of these aren't even investigated, or the autopsies that prove drowning aren't even there. They just say, oh, he's in water, he's drowned. So I think that, but I look back, and I'm over 50 now, but I look back at my college years, I was like high risk, man. I remember certain situations at bars that were much more dangerous than anything that I ever thought.
Sure. No, I'm right there with you. I've definitely looked back at various encounters I've had at bars and thought, wonder if that could have worked out a different way.
Yeah, no, I can think a couple offhand of like, what was really happening, what's really going on. And I was actually drugged in a bar one time. That actually did happen to me. I know these are real things because I lived it in 2003. Yeah, no. I have another friend, the same thing. Weird things happen. I know people who I give 100% credibility to who said, I had to have been drugged. And that's actually happening a lot in L.A. I keep hearing stories because I've got my antennae out to listen to these stories. And apparently in these bars in L.A., it's very common. And everybody knows they can be drugged. Yeah,
that's scary.
Like, they're really suspicious. Like, they don't look in the context of, like, SFK. But, like, the girls are super paranoid. And the men know, too. Like, you can get rolled, You just wake up and your money's gone.
And before I forget here, one note I had on that Alex Holden. I think, if you're looking for a high-profile victim where his family may, in fact, follow up on this. Aside from Chris Jenkins, where his uncle was, one of the district FBI heads. the victim from Minneapolis who has had his case turned to homicide. It didn't seem that his uncle being high up in the FBI seemed to aid the family much, though, in the investigation and activities associated. However, with Alex Holden, his uncle was the former governor of Missouri, and both of his mom and dad are judges in Missouri. So I think this one might be a little bit different. I think these folks might end up following through.
Well, I hope they do. Springfield, Missouri is where he was from. So that might make things more difficult. But I'd really be interested to see what his dad, somebody who's, has that kind of legal training and looked at all the facts and can really sift through things. And I'd be interested to see what his father comes up with, because both families, and this goes for the families of all the victims, are all traumatized and shattered. It's just a horrible event. And they all really want to know the truth. You can just see Dakota James's mom is still looking around. So then all the parents actually who were interviewed by Gilbertson and Gannon, all are still, it's still a very important part of their lives, is the loss of their child. So it's just a horrific tragedy. And it's a shame that the government has dropped the ball on this. It's just
and
not
I think
priority.
Conversations like this, getting the topic out to be discussed more so on the interwebs to larger communities, I think this is the way that this phenomenon goes away, because I just don't see anyone motivated from any point of authority, be it political or law enforcement, to get behind any aspect of this. I don't see that changing anytime soon, based upon just my experience in both politics and law enforcement.
Yeah, sadly, I agree with you.
There would have to be something, a motivating event. I don't see anything like that occurring with ostensibly an occult network that is well versed in staying beneath the surface. This is not something that they're not used to doing. So, hiding additional details when they're already hiding their entire network, I don't think that's much of a stretch for their skill sets.
Yeah, it's bad. Yeah, it's bad. I mean, it's not a good situation. I feel sorry for people like Holden or other people, recent victims, because somebody could have got the word out. The government could put a warning out, or local communities could put warnings out like, hey, you can be drugged if you're a man or a woman. And,
sure. And I guess I have one more question for you, or one more topic I'd like to discuss with you today, William, on the Smiley Face Killers here, and that is one issue that I don't think anyone solved. You've asked the question. I've heard a lot of other people ask the question: why these locations? Why are young men being victimized in these locations?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there seems to be a much more urban issue, so it doesn't seem to be rural, although there are outliers.
I can give you a lot of rural examples. Maybe not like completely like extremely rural. I mean, obviously near cities, but I think, are there areas of the U.S. that seem to be higher concentration, maybe, as opposed to not necessarily urban and rural, but like geographically, like Boston, New York? These seem like some hot spots.
Yeah, Boston, yes. Yeah. Boston, New York, absolutely. Illinois or Chicago. A little bit in San Francisco. Portland, for sure. I would say that those are all the really hot spots. And then there's like, sprinkled around the Midwest, definitely. And some in Florida. But certain cities don't seem to have any at all.
What do you think is causing that? I actually have a list of cities that have that I have been able to find. I have not found any victims that would fit any of these profile points as far as the standard victimology of the Smiley Face Killer victims. The young man who goes drunk at a bar, gets separated from his group, then disappears for sometimes 2 days, sometimes like you said, 40 days in some cases, and then is found in a body of water, presumably drowned. However, after further analysis by families hiring an additional coroner to do another examination, they find ligature marks, they find burn marks, they find no water in the lungs, they find evidence that it wasn't a drowning as it was prescribed. And we have cities that don't have these, so what do you think is causing that?
I don't know. What do you think?
My personal perspective is that occult groups have taken to some occult practices of ancient times here in America. For whatever reason that may be, I don't know. Whether it's something new that they've decided that, well, these sites where many of these folks were found are mound sites. These are ancient mound sites that exist across America where human sacrifice used to exist. And I often wonder, have modern day occult groups decided to prescribe to that ancient practice and commit human sacrifice at those same locations? And
it's possible. I mean, I think the thing is you would have to extrapolate that as to why it's happening in the UK, Europe,
I'm
some
glad you
cases
mentioned that,
in
because
Thailand.
that's where I would get back to the actual different specific cells. So what I would be saying there would be like maybe a cell would be prescribing to do those rituals at those sites, where another cell has opted to do something somewhere else. And over time and time again, I look at these things. Kyle Rogers, for example. I'll use two examples from your part two. Kyle Rogers was a classic case. East Coast, Illinois. So mainly East Coast, kind of Midwest. Well, that's a mound city that he lived in, and the park that he was found adjacent to is a mound park. And so the city that he was residing in was Belvedere, Illinois, which is in Boone County, Illinois. And if you go into the Boone County historical record, you can find that the Boone County courthouse was constructed as the first building of the town on a mound in a ceremonial cornerstone type ritual, if you will. So there's a long history of these towns getting built on these mounds. The further you go out west, maybe not as much. States like New Mexico have no mounds, for example. They also have no victims, fitting a smiley face killer, drunk kid at a bar goes missing, etc. Characteristic points. But when you get out to Sacramento, for example, that's another mound city in California, and where your victim Alex Holden was found is another mound site. Discovery Park and that whole area around American River and the Sacramento River interchange was a mound complex. So, as more and more of these cases do happen here in America, I continue to ask that question. I agree with you that the incidents in other nations may not be following that same precise pattern, but then it simply causes me to ask, is this simply just another issue of a different cell is operating in a different manner?
Right. Well, it's possible. I've always, even the original case that I studied of Joey LaBute was he was disappeared during the Arnold Schwarzenegger Classic, where people are flying in and out of that city. So it's potential, and other people have speculated maybe these victims are held for somebody else. They're not even captured for themselves, which is even really really dark and evil. Like we got to fly, yeah. And there's really scary story. I don't want to go into detail of these kind of international trafficking in children. I mean, really gnarly stuff out of Ukraine and Philippines, and even this guy Yao of God out of Brazil. Just horror stories, and Epstein too. So I mean, you could see that these SFK could be potential connected to even those types of cases. It's not outside of the realm of possibility.
Definitely not.
I got a call for this guy. I want him to be 24 years old. I want this look. Somebody goes out, and finder's fee.
That sounds like how Epstein's operating. So it sounds like we've already had networks operating precisely like you just described underneath the surface for years.
Yeah, so it's real ugly. Yeah. And I mean, look at how long Epstein operated for. 30 years. 30 years he was up to all kinds of shenanigans. He was able to accrue $500 million. What was he doing? The totality is never... And actually, I heard an interview with one of the original victims, and she saw all these kids, and they're not accounted for.
I heard that interview, yeah.
And she didn't say, like... Yeah, was that True News?
I remember the victim's name, Maria Farmer. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that was her.
Yeah, so she was...
really dark, evil stuff
Maria
is happening.
Farmer was saying these kids that she saw were... No one knows, right?
Yeah, they don't even know where they came. And there's reports of unknown kids coming out of Venezuela. The worst.
And one thing some of the stuff Maria Farmer said, and I thought I knew a lot about Epstein, and I took note of her early on because that happened not far from me here in Ohio, actually. fearless lectures.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And she said that Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein were essentially, close associates in 1995.
Wow,
the current storyline goes, Bill Gates met Jeffrey Epstein around 2009, I believe, and has publicly stated that he doesn't even know Jeffrey Epstein, even though there's plenty of evidence claiming that that's a lie.
Yeah, everything publicly about Epstein's a lie. I mean, it's just all lies. His whole background's a lie. What he owned is a lie. What he did was a lie. There's no records of him being a financial advisor. He might be advising people about money, but there's no reporting or anything.
No reporting. He allegedly was a teacher at a private school without ever graduating college.
Yeah, it's like his personality's like a cutout, just like an intel op. I mean, it's unbelievable for me to believe that they let Ghislaine Maxwell get away. It's unbelievable. It's such a total incompetence by the U.S. government, man. Off the charts. Like, if other people could figure out what's going on, like the journalists, it's just like, where's the government? You have access.
Yeah, I'd really like to know what's going on with that situation personally, because Ghislaine Maxwell seemed like such an easy target to arrest.
There's tons of evidence, man. There's people talking about her. I mean,
what else are we looking for?
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah, so that's a good example, because that whole network thrived for decades.
Yes, a massive network, international, traveling around. If you look at his flight records, he's bouncing in between all kinds of weird places: Tangier, France, Venezuela. Just no oversight with those planes. Very little oversight.
All those are good points, and the fact that he used such an old jet is also odd to me. There must be.
Why is
that's
that?
An old. Are you familiar with the DB Cooper case? The guy that hijacked $200,000 from the airlines and then jumped out of an airline plane. This is like circa 1972.
Yes.
And he jumped out of the same model jet that Jeffrey Epstein used. And for some, that old.
Really?
Exactly.
That old.
And it's not only is it the age of the aircraft, because aircraft, I spent years in the Air Force. I've been around a lot of procurement of aircraft from all the manufacturers, etc. They make some fine products, and they last. C-130s have been in service since 1960, 1958, and they still do great work for the United States Air Force today. So airplanes can last long. The point being with his is that he had such a unique model, the ability to get aircraft parts, to find a mechanic to work on it, etc., just wasn't as readily available as newer models that he should have been able to afford.
That's weird. Do you think that he had it so he could dump stuff out of the back?
That's why I think he had it, because he could open up that back hatch while in flight, under maybe 15,000 feet altitude. You could open up that hatch and have no problems. You could dump people, goods, you name it.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, it's all a shame, man. It's all a shame that a lot of that information, he had to go, man. They had to kill him. All that information and stuff could not come out.
Sure.
So,
yeah, it just makes you wonder what if a cult network of what you and I have discussed here for the last hour could be thriving today. And I think that is a great, case study of how it could be thriving today.
Absolutely, that's a great point. So there are overlaps, and if you look at Epstein, if you read the autobiography by Virginia Giuffre, he had like secret tunnels. He had statues to Pan. He had Horus on that weird temple in his island. He had a bunch of other really creepy people who were literal occult illuminated.
Right.
I don't want to name their names, but they have a different religion, man.
I think
it's not
spot
a Christian
on. And
religion.
one thing I noticed about Jeffrey Epstein, and you might have some information on this with your knowledge of Thelema, he appears to sign everything with the infinity symbol. If it's not the infinity symbol, it looks a lot like it.
Yeah, I mean, right there. I don't know that if there's a secret meaning there, but he was involved in all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, his connections. If you look at some of these, he was going to he was flying to Monterey, and hanging out with like the heads of Google, the head of YouTube. There's pictures with him with all kinds of people with a lot of juice, a lot of power. And, you know, you don't know what his full attraction was. And I mean, they're still covering up for him. The crazy thing is people were covering up for him for decades. And I think, like, if you look at like Dershowitz and Cernovich and some of these other guys, I mean, I'm watching some of these interviews. It's clear they're log rolling for and covering up for what they knew happened. Like, people would look at this guy Mark Levin on TV, and I'm just looking at him talk to Dershowitz and going, "You're not even asking the right question." They actually had Joe Rogan had Jeffrey Epstein's cook on his show. This guy Perry, yeah, and he didn't even ask him any questions about Epstein.
Wow.
It's the most important, relevant because this guy Perry gets mentioned by Giuffre in her autobiography. Yeah, so you can sit still.
Wow, I think I know exactly who you're talking about. I don't really watch the Joe Rogan show much, but I did see that he had a chef on there, and I was wondering kind of who was this guy, and that was Epstein's chef, huh?
Oh,
wow.
Yeah, Adam Perry Lang. His name. It was actually published 1 week ago. And you want to talk about? We can get into. I could do a full show on Rogan and all of the stuff he's covered up because he's like 2 degrees of separation from Epstein. He's had this guy Pinker. He's had Krause. All these dudes he mixed with Epstein.
Well, actually, the scientists
he's covered up for him. Yeah. No. Rogan.
I'd actually, William, if you'd like to have that conversation in the future, please keep me in mind. I'd love to have that conversation.
Anytime. Well, I could tell you all this stuff because he also has this guy who's like pals with Damien Eccles, who was a convicted child killer on Netflix.
Oh,
this guy, Duncan Trussell.
Yeah. I mean, Rogan's associate Stanhope seems to be integrated into that network as well with Johnny Depp and Marilyn Manson and possibly The Process, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, you should see. And then Rogan also was this other musician. All these guys who are all fans of Damien Eccles. It's Henry Rollins.
Damien Eccles, correct.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that these ones are all connected to
Rogan.
Oh, yeah.
And
the other guy's
name that's what I'm getting at. I think Rogan's best friend is best friends with Johnny Depp. Yeah.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Who's which one? I didn't know that. So Stanhope is friends with Depp?
His best friends are apparently Marilyn Manson and
Johnny
Depp. Yeah, supposedly.
I had no
that's what
idea.
That's what I would love to have a conversation like this. This sounds like something we need to record in the future, William.
I think so. It sounds good. We should probably wrap this up. I need to go get another cup of coffee or something. But yeah, no, I didn't know that. No, we should talk offline. I'll make a little list. We'll just riff off of all these strange connections.
Well, it was excellent talking to you once again. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your efforts in documenting the Smiley Face Killers. I think you've done an excellent job once again with your second documentary.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Well, it's great to talk with you. You're so knowledgeable. It's good to know somebody is keeping notes and also knows the cases.
Absolutely.
So it's great to be with you again.
Well, let's talk again soon.
Love to. Yeah, love to.
Okay, thank you.
Love to. All right, bye-bye.